Coming up, can we wait that long? We really don't have a choice, but can we stand it? Well, that's a different question. Welcome back to Political Spirits. I'm your host, Franklin Rye. We still stand for the proposition that the left and the right should have a few drinks and talk. Compromise is not a requirement. If those discussions result in us changing or even abandoning our positions, that's fine. If they don't, that's fine too. We just need to talk to each other. In that way, we can unify through speech. And if the discussion becomes a bit heated at the end of the night, we should still be able to split up the bar tab and be on our way. So what are we going to talk about this week? Well, the first thing I want to do is to remind everyone exactly where we stand in the election process. Lots of people are wondering, where's the evidence of large-scale voter fraud, of large-scale election fraud? The evidence that clearly shows flipping Trump votes to Biden, presumably using some sort of software code. There's been plenty of individual anecdotal evidence of wrongful conduct backed up by sworn affidavits, such as those regarding running ballots through the machine multiple times or failing to compare signatures on envelopes to signatures in the voting records for absentee or other mail-in votes. And those allegations do support the contention of at least thousands of instances of wrongful vote counting, but what everyone is eager to actually see is documentation in support of allegations of electronic switching of votes from Biden to Trump, presumably using some sort of computer algorithm. You may be asking, why haven't we seen that yet? And the thing every citizen must keep in mind is that there are 4 stages in the election process: the voting stage, the counting or tabulation stage, the canvassing stage, and the certification stage. We are ending the counting or tabulation stage, and we are just beginning the canvassing stage. The canvassing stage is the one where election reports from local jurisdictions are collected and reviewed and double-checked. That's also the stage where recounts occur, such as the recount being performed in Georgia right now. So the answer as to why we haven't seen that detailed evidence yet is that the likely stage where that would be uncovered is the canvassing stage. So what are we looking at, time-wise? Another 1 to 2 weeks before we really see what the volume of evidence of voter fraud and election fraud will be. Can we wait that long? We really don't have a choice. But can we stand it? Well, that's a different question. When I was much younger, I lived through the introduction of the music video, those mini-movies matched to current popular music that you so rarely see today. This was back in the days when MTV, music television, was launched, and back then it actually showed music on television. It's hard to believe that with all the distractions of the internet that watching music videos could ever be much of a draw. But it was a huge thing back in the day, and people who grew up in those days were often called the MTV generation. And commentators would routinely talk about how short their attention spans were because they were pegged to the length of a music video. Basically, if you couldn't get your point across in 3 to 3.5 minutes at most, the maximum length of a typical music video, then you had no shot at making the sale or making your point. So if music videos shorten people's attention spans, think about what smartphones have done to our attention spans now. There are so many options on the internet that if a video or an article doesn't basically reach out and grab you by the throat or pull you in as if by a tractor beam almost instantaneously, you're off to the next video or article option. So think about that impact, that perspective when wrapping your head around how long it's going to take to see just how much evidence there is of large-scale voter fraud and election fraud. We're going to have to try to adjust our expectations to a time before the smartphone, the internet, and even before music videos. I know it's going to be tough, but we can wait a week or two. Next topic. Ecocide. I recently read an article on BBC.com which I found terrifying, but which many people on the left would find encouraging, and that says a lot. The article by Sophie Yao appeared on November 5 and was entitled Ecocide: Should Killing Nature be a crime. It notes that Ambassador John Licht of the island nation of Vanuatu has suggested an amendment to the treaty known as the Rome Statute, which set up the International Criminal Court. The proposed amendment would, quote, criminalize acts that amount to ecocide, close quote. Mr. Licht argued that, quote, this radical idea merits serious discussion, close quote. The article recognizes that individual countries' laws and regulations are meant to prevent environmental devastation through acts which could be characterized as ecocide, but it notes that those supporting amending the Rome Statute to give the International Criminal Court the power to prosecute for ecocide assert that only a global law prohibiting such acts will stop them. So perhaps you think that they have a point. What's wrong with laws making mass environmental destruction illegal worldwide and providing for their enforcement in the International Criminal Court? There's a lot wrong with it, and frankly, it terrifies me. As I said, such an approach would go a long way towards abandoning national sovereignty. Just because we may think a particular act constitutes ecocide doesn't mean that the governments of other countries agree. Think I'm being too negative? Well, get a load of this. Proponents of this approach assert that the crime of ecocide, quote, should only apply to the most serious harms, close quote. And they give examples which include industrial livestock farming and tar sand extraction. Think about that. There are plenty of disagreements from country to country about the way farming should be engaged in. This approach would criminalize acts of farming in conflict with the view taken by certain global actors. If you've ever wondered whether the authoritarian tendencies of those on the left extend to international restrictions, this should answer your question. If you engage in farming on an industrial level in a way with which they disagree, it's a candidate for criminal prohibitions, including the potential for jail sentences administered by the International Criminal Court, even if your own country in its own laws doesn't prohibit such farming. And don't think it's limited to industrial farming. Tar sands extraction would qualify as well. Canada extracts oil from tar sands. This proposal would criminalize that activity. What does the concept of ecocide prosecutions administered in the International Criminal Court represent? It represents an opportunity for the left, for the Democrat Party in America, to find a way to pursue environmental restrictions on an international basis which they could never get past in America itself. All the more reason to make darn sure that the Democrats don't win the 2 special elections in Georgia, which would give them control of the U.S. Senate. Next topic. Republican populism. For my entire adult life, I've been a conservative, but the version of conservative I've been, or perhaps the focus of my conservatism, has changed over time. In significant part, that's been because of a recognition of the changing nature of our country, the changing nature of its economy, and the most serious challenges we've faced at any given time. I've said before that in presidential elections, I've always voted on 2 concerns: the economy and national security, and which one ranks higher varies from election to election. I've also noted that in 2016 I added a 3rd issue, freedom of speech. I've watched the suppression of speech on college campuses, the demonization of conservative viewpoints, the refusal to accept conservative speakers, the bullying and even violent attacks on anyone who pushed a conservative viewpoint on campus, and I was not only appalled by what I saw, but convinced that the suppression of speech would expand beyond the campuses to impact the rest of society. That 3rd issue made my vote for Donald Trump in 2016 even more enthusiastic than it would have been otherwise. But there's something else that was building within my conservative focus, and President Trump was not only at the right place at the right time for me, but his version of conservatism helped me understand my own more clearly. For years, I've felt that our politics are broken, and one of the ways in which they're broken is the one which I talk about at the start of every podcast. There was a time when we could have political debates with our friends and acquaintances in this country, and if we disagreed, we wouldn't lose a friend or acquaintance. Virtually everybody understood that if you're going to have a government of, for, and by the people, if you're going to have a democracy, or in our case, a constitutional republic, you have to understand that the one thing that will never happen is that everybody will agree on political issues. If everybody agreed, you wouldn't even need to have a democracy or constitutional republic. What would be the point? Everybody would think the same thing. That's why the efforts of those on the left to suppress speech are so anti-democratic, are so fundamentally authoritarian and dictatorial. But I've also recognized that our system, in the form of the economy, is broken in another way as well. It's hollowed out. Before Donald Trump became president, wages and salaries in the bottom half of the economy had been stagnant for decades. The importation of massive numbers of illegal immigrants had stagnated wages for no-skill and low-skilled labor in the U.S. It can't be denied. It's simply a function of supply and demand. Import millions of new laborers without a corresponding equal increase in the number of jobs available, and applicable wages will stagnate or even shrink. That's how an economy works. Stagnant wages are good for companies trying to keep their labor costs to a minimum, but they are obviously bad for those trying to raise families on those stagnant wages. And above the bottom end of the economy, salaries were being held down by offshoring of back-office jobs and importation of visa holders being paid artificially low wage rates. The more I saw that occur, the more I was reminded of the graphic somebody placed on a billboard in Seattle during the severe economic downturn in 1971 known as the Boeing bust. It said simply, quote, "Will the last person leaving Seattle turn out the lights?" Close quote. The more I heard about people's jobs being sent out of the country and corporate IT positions in America being replaced by visa holders, the more I wondered who would be around to turn out the lights. The more it seemed to me that we were creating an economy hollowed, out of balance, weighted to the favor of a very defined group of individuals most well-positioned to take advantage of the growth of globalism. And the more I saw that, the more worried I became. A hollowed-out economy is an unstable economy. If you take huge swaths of the country, especially those occupied by the middle class, and stagnate their wages to the point that it becomes open to question whether raising a family is a doable option, people become increasingly desperate, and they're prone to make poor decisions, including poor political decisions. And those decisions can sometimes be so bad that they can destroy economies and countries. But sometimes the right leader can come along to prevent that from happening. Look at the foolish pursuit of socialism by far too many young people in America. It reminds me of something one of my favorite political commentators once said, and this commentator was so impressive, so worthy of admiration, that I urged my kids to watch documentaries about his life and how he was able to achieve so much and overcome incredible challenges. That commentator was Charles Krautheimer, the wheelchair-bound, quadriplegic, Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and television political commentator who changed over time from being a liberal Democrat to a conservative Republican when it became apparent that it was the Republicans, not the Democrats, who were going to firmly oppose communism. I have long thought that Franklin Delano Roosevelt went too far with his expansion of the federal government. He took it to the point that his aggressive intrusions into the economy probably prolonged the Great Depression. But it was Charles Krautheimer who gave me a new perspective in that regard. Krautheimer contended, and I think he was right, that FDR prevented communism from growing in the United States. The impact of the Great Depression was so severe, the cries from the populace for help were so widespread that an ordinary reaction would not do. By intervening in the economy far more than any prior president had ever done, FDR probably prevented communism from gaining a foothold in the electorate. That was Krautheimer's contention, and as I said, he was probably right. Some people have said that the United States is the luckiest country on earth. And when we have so often eventually seemed to find the right person at the right time when it comes to the presidency, it lends credence to the argument. I would say Donald Trump is like FDR in that respect. Socialism is gaining a foothold within the Democratic Party. Notwithstanding the characterization of Joe Biden as a moderate, it's pretty clear he's in no position to outright reject what the left is pushing. And notwithstanding the desires of some establishment Republicans, presidential candidates like Mitt Romney are not going to appeal to enough of the electorate to defeat Democrats. It takes a Republican with a strong dose of populism to do that. It takes a Republican willing to stand up for the working class, to reach out, asking African Americans and Hispanics to join him, to fight to preserve jobs in the U.S., to not roll over to corporate interests on the issue of visas, to fight the censorship of big tech, to stand up for the rights of Americans to voice their political views without fear of being censored or silenced or fired from their jobs. President Trump went further on those issues than I've ever seen a president go before, and I still hold out hope he'll be reelected. We're going to have to wait a couple of weeks to see the evidence. If he isn't reelected, consider the next 4 years to be the tryouts for the next Republican nominee. If Donald Trump doesn't win this year, and he doesn't run again in 2024, the Republican Party had better build on the populist path he set them on and continue his minority outreach and give the cold shoulder to any budding new Mitt Romneys and John McCains out there. Not only would seeking out another Mitt Romney or John McCain doom the Republican Party in the general election, but it would abandon what is perhaps the most encouraging impact of Donald Trump on the political culture. President Trump's successful outreach to minorities raises the possibility of the death of identity politics. If the next Republican candidate can build on that success, it would mean that the populace is beginning to understand that the political divides in this country are along economic lines. That's not to say that people from different economic classes can't agree on the best political approaches. It simply means that you can't ignore the needs of a substantial economic group without risking losing that entire group at the ballot box. Democrats have been able to do that without risking losing that entire group because they've been able to play the identity politics game. Major portions of the working class are comprised of Hispanics and African Americans. Because of identity politics, the Democratic Party has been free to focus on the very rich and the very poor, and then fill in the gaps to win elections by stoking tensions based on identity politics. Because of identity politics, for example, black voters in the middle class who should seriously consider voting Republican based on Republican policies which are pro-small business, committed to lowering taxes, directed at reducing or eliminating illegal immigration, and reducing job-killing regulations may instead vote Democrat because they think Republicans hate them. With a renewed focus on populism and minority outreach, the Republican Party can destroy identity politics and allow the political system to function as it was always intended. The bottom line, if you ignore the needs of the middle class will rise up at the ballot box and defeat you. Identity politics has allowed Democrats to avoid that bottom line. By following the populist path, Republicans can ensure Democrats can ignore it no longer. And the populist path is the Republican path to victory. And you know what you can be sure we at Political Spirits will never ignore? We'll never ignore our listeners who expect to hear from us every week. We'll be back next week with another episode of Political Spirits. Please be sure to join us for that next episode and tell your friends to do so as well. And follow the podcast on Facebook at Political Spirits. And follow me and the podcast on Twitter at Franklin Rye. And remember, all episodes are now on YouTube as well, and the YouTube channel is named Political Spirits Network. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. And select all after you hit the bell. This is Franklin Rye. Thank you for listening.